So, this is a talk about the recreation of cooking, food, chefs, and magic. However, not only is this a conversation about the recreation of cooking, but more importantly, this is a talk about the recreation of the way that we think about cooking, the way that we talk about food, and the way that we talk about those who cook our food. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to start by talking about 4 ways in society in which we talk about food, 4 aspects that we address every day in our lives. I'm then going to look a little bit at magic and how magic has been understood in the classical anthropological and sociological sense. I'm then going to bring these 2 together and ultimately to conclude, what does that say about us? If we talk about food as magic, what are we actually talking about? So here are 4 shows that you probably all are a little bit familiar with. We see Top Chef, Chopped, Iron Chef America, Man vs. Food. Now, these shows have a huge viewership. The Food Network has 99 million subscribers. The Cooking Channel has 60 million subscribers. An episode of Top Chef has 2 million viewers alone. 1 single episode. That's a huge quantity of people watching food, talking about food, looking at food external from eating it. Now, along with that, we also are talking about celebrity chefs. This is a new phenomenon that's taken off since the 1980s, with the first being Wolfgang Puck, who began this new craze. Now, pretty much everyone in this room could probably recognize at least 3 people that are on this slide. If I were to name them, you probably would know more. Anthony Bourdain, Mario Batali, Tom Colicchio, Jamie Oliver, Gordon Ramsay. Half of them have given TED Talks. They've become household names. We talk about them the way that we used to only talk about celebrities that were in entertainment, actors, musicians, singers, and this has been a huge shift. Now, food has also been talked about as science. Food has become a new frontier to explore, to push the bounds of creativity, to push the bounds of science. This slide is an image that was taken last year at Harvard University during a class that was offered on science and cooking. And science and cooking has become not only a class, but it's become this huge public ordeal where you have a sold-out lecture where hundreds of people from the community are coming in to watch these chefs talk, chefs from around the world talk about food and cooking and experimentation on that level. Now, on this slide, we have 2 chefs, Harold McGee, who wrote the first popular book that combined food and science. It was called On Science and Cooking, and Dave Arnold, who's a molecular gastronomist in New York, and I used to work in his lab. And he develops technology for most of the restaurants in New York that are really innovative with molecular gastronomy and continues to push the boundaries. So both of these chefs are actually talking about a 3rd chef, Wiley Dufresne, whose work has become popular because he appeared on Top Chef Masters, and on this show he experimented with these techniques. So here we have these 2 chefs talking about Wiley's work, and in particular one dish on the top corner, his shrimp noodles. Now, what are shrimp noodles? How are they made? Why is it worth talking about? Basically, the way that this chef works with this material is that he takes shrimp, cooks them, adds some spices, tosses it all in a very high-speed blender, puts it on high, and basically ends up with shrimp liquid paste. He then adds an enzyme called transglutaminase, also known as meat glue. And meat glue reactivates the proteins in the shrimp, causing it to bind in a new way, allowing you to create new forms. So he then puts it in a piping bag and pipes it into boiling hot water as you would piping icing onto a cake, and then cooks it, giving you the form of noodles that look like pasta. However, when you taste it, it tastes nothing like that. It's shrimp in a new form, pushing the boundaries of what you expect and what you taste. Now, here are 2 lyrics from recent hip-hop songs. We have Jay-Z's Success and Drake's The Ride. Both of these lyrics talk about restaurant names and chefs in New York and Napa Valley, restaurants that are incredibly expensive. Napa Valley's restaurant with the French Laundry that Drake talks about is $300 a head, at the minimum, not including wine. These are status symbols. Food and chefs and restaurants are being talked about in the same way that we used to talk about cars, that we used to talk about money, big houses. They're symbols of society and symbols of what you can achieve. So taking a pause, what is magic? And how is cooking magical? So in order to understand this, I'm going to look at 3 different philosophers that we talk about that are the foundations of classical anthropology and sociology: Marcel Mauss, James Frazer, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and how they understand magic, and how this can be combined into one coherent understanding of the topic. So, first, magic is transformational. Magic acts as taking one object and transforming it into something completely different. Magic inherently is an alchemical process, moving one thing into something that was almost unrecognizable before. Second, magic is active. And what this means is that magic has a definite outcome. Whenever magic is enacted, you are guaranteed a result, a specific, predetermined result. And so therefore, when you talk about magical action, when the term magic is employed in anthropological theory, you know that you're going, if you do the ritual properly, you're going to get a specific outcome. And the reason that you need this, which is different than prayer, than hope, than desire, all of which you want something to happen, but it's not guaranteed, is that magic is a way of coping with the world. It's a way of remaking the way that you understand the world to be what you need it to be at that very moment. And Sartre talks about this when he talks about emotion as magic. Emotion is a way of remaking our space. We don't know how to handle something that we're confronted with. And we change our emotions. We change how we're being perceived and how we're perceiving. And that allows us to cope with what's in front of us. Also, whenever you see magical action, we know that magic is a method of controlling the chaotic. It is a way of solving a specific problem. If magical language is used, there's a problem that needs to be solved. There's something that we don't know how to deal with, that we have to transform and we have to control. So, we've been talking about food and magic, and I believe that we talk about food in 2 ways as magical in our society today. The first is that food is transformational. We're able to use food as a space of play, a space to experiment with new forms. Here we see a dish from the chef Heston Blumenthal from the restaurant called the Fat Duck in London, or in Bray, England, rather. And it's a radish ravioli. And it's a play on this classical British dish from the 1950s where they serve pâté alongside a radish. Now, Heston Blumenthal wanted to reimagine this. He wanted to transform this very basic dish into something elevated, something beautiful. So here we see the result. You can see the radishes, but they're completely a different form. There's something beyond what we ever would have expected. Here's another dish from his restaurant, macerated strawberries with leather and olive puree and a black pepper sorbet. Now, these tastes are not what we would necessarily think of as appealing. They don't necessarily seem to go together. Who has ever wanted to eat leather puree? But when put into the hands of someone like Heston Blumenthal, it's elevated. It's beautiful and surprising. Now, food also has a second element for us. Food is transformative. And what I mean by this is that we've begun to perceive food as something that you can ingest. And when you ingest this, it changes you from the inside out. Food can act as a magic potion that allows us to become who we want to become, as these headlines from recent magazines, food can make you skinnier, it can make you sexier, it can make you happy, it can make you smarter. Or in my personal favorite from a recent Men's Health article, food can just make you more awesome. Now, that's not really defined what that even means, but we see here that food can actually work on us. By eating this way, we can transform ourselves. We can take food and use it to become more than what we already are. Now, Marcel Mauss, who wrote A General Theory of Magic, talks about the magician a lot. And he gives about 18 characteristics for what the magician is and how you can recognize one who is a magician. And I realized that when I began this master's degree that I was reading a lot of anthropological theory, and I discovered that you could actually substitute the word magician for chef in all of Mauss's writings, and you would actually have an almost exact transference between these 2 topics. So, we'll get into those exactly, but first Mauss actually talks about magical rites as precisely those which at first glance seem to be imbued with the least amount of sacred power. And I find that particularly compelling, as that allows us to talk about food in the language of magic. Food is inherently earthy. It is not sacred. But it can become so, and that is what can put us into the realm of magic. And then Mauss goes on to talk about magical skills and how magical skills are inherited. And he writes that some are acquired, some are inherited. To some, these qualities are lent, while others actually possess them. And what that means is that magic is something that has to be given to you. It has to be transferred, or you have to be born with it, and it has to be inherited. And when I began to interview chefs for this project a year and a half ago, I realized that all of them, without prompting, at some point in the interview, began to talk about how cooking could be a learned skill. But to be a chef, to be someone who really could manipulate this ingredient, that you have to be born with. That's inherent knowledge that you have to be gifted to you. So Mauss goes on to talk about gender, and he says that it's men who perform magic while women are accused of it. And I find that particularly interesting in the relationship between food and cooking and magic. We think of food and of cooking as an inherently feminine realm. We think about women as being in the kitchen. Yet, when you think about the famous chefs, when you look at restaurant culture, it's the men who are doing the cooking. The men are the magicians. Women are accused of it, but men are the sorcerers. So Mauss also goes on to make a connection between witchcraft and sexuality, and it's really not hard to describe that taste is inherently sensuous. We can't really extricate these ideas from each other. And then he goes on to talk about the tools of the magician, which themselves end up having magical properties in consecration. The wand. And when you think about cooking, the image of the chef's knife pops into our minds. It's one of the first images that we come across. And for those who cook in a professional kitchen, there's this ritualistic obsession with having the perfect knife. Every night after service, you sharpen it till it becomes the perfect tool to do the work that you need it to do. Without it, you're basically lost. So just like the wand, the chef's knife actually takes on its own properties. It becomes something else. So what? If magic works to solve a problem, to control chaos, and cooking is magical, the chef is magician, why do we need food to be magical? And what in 2012 are the problems that magical cooking is working to resolve? What this means is that when we think about food, when we talk about food as magical, that means that there's some underlying chaos. There's some discomfort that we have surrounding food that causes us to think about it, to talk about it in this way. So I want to look again at these slides from the beginning. These 4 images are all shows about cooking, yet there's not a single image of food on any of them. There's images of chefs, and we see something that looks basically like a Vegas magician performance, yet there's not a single piece of food. These shows are about cooking, but we're uncomfortable with the food itself. And that gets to the point that we're actually uncomfortable with cooking. More Americans watch these shows, talk about food, than ever actually cook. And that's an actual statistic. How many of us are planning to go home and cook tonight? How many are planning to go home and cook tomorrow night, the night after that, and then the night after that? Well, some people are still cooking. As a society, we're not doing it as much as we previously have. We're uncomfortable with what cooking actually means. We're worried about safety. We're worried about taste. And therein steps in the chef. We need someone to pass that on to pass on our worries and our discomforts. And that's, again, where you hear magical language. We're all familiar with Paul Prudhomme's magic seasoning blends, poultry magic, beef magic. They're ways of transforming food into something that could taste the way we want it to. But we don't really know as a society how to do that anymore. In addition, I think it's particularly interesting to notice that all of these chefs, again, are men, and also that many of these images sort of embody the look and feel of magical action, the magician, as you would define it if you were giving out a playbill for a magical show. So back to food and science. There's 2 areas of discomfort here. The first is in terms of nutrition and health. As a culture, we're so concerned about obesity. We're concerned about our children's nutritional lunches. These are constant discussions every day in the media. We're worried about what food can do to us. We're worried about how food can transform us. And we're concerned. So in addition, we're also concerned about what these creative elements can actually do. So when people were polled looking at this shrimp noodle dish after this lecture, it was found that most of the people in the audience actually had no interest in eating this. And probably many of us wouldn't necessarily want to eat this either. It's interesting. It's interesting to talk about. It's interesting to think about. But it's not necessarily something that we want to put into our mouths. And that demonstrates that food has become, again, more than about sustenance, more than about nutrition and taste. We're interested in watching it for so many other reasons. And we're also worried about our food supply. When we talk about something like transglutaminase, we're concerned about what that actually means and why we're putting it in our food continuously. It comes up much more than any of us actually realize. Many more restaurants are using it. It's in more than we know. And that's concerning, particularly when you think about its original use as it was developed in World War I to basically stop and cauterize bleeding during battle. So if you can have something that acted as a medical response, and now we're putting it into our food supply, it's another area of concern. It's another area to consider and to watch, and helps to explain why we're talking about food in this way. Now, finally, going back to the lyrics from Drake's The Ride, what does food say about status? And I think that inherently we're uncomfortable with what food can actually say about us. What our knowledge about food, what we eat, the choices that we make, what does that say about who we are and where we stand in society? And I think that therefore when we talk about local versus non-local, organic versus inorganic, what does that actually mean? What are we actually talking about? And ultimately the result of that is that we're talking about whether or not it's monetarily viable to eat that way. Food is allowing us to transform this conversation into something that we're more comfortable dealing with. Talking about food is another way of talking about this inherently uncomfortable issue. So therefore, thinking about this food this way has actually problematized it more. Food as magic has caused us to see things in a new light, to cause more problems than to necessarily fix them. But what I want you to walk away with today is that there's something valuable in thinking about things in this creative manner, of thinking about food by incorporating other areas of study and other elements of culture. So I urge you, when you walk out of here today, not just to think about food as magical, but to think about how else we can consider food in this creative manner. How else can we talk about food, and how else can we really understand what we actually mean when we talk about food? We're talking about so many different things on so many levels. And it's only through creative methodology, through incorporating other elements, that we can begin to get to the root of that. Thank you.